couple items I'll chat about briefly and then turn it over to you guys. See what's on your mind today. Been a while. Where you been?
Filling in for the week.
All right. Nice to have you back.
Thank you.
The county executive, as you know, sent over his FY13 budget adjustments. Assuming, for purpose of this conversation, that his characterization of one of the items is budget neutral, it's about a $2.5, maybe $3 million set of issues. It pales in comparison to the number that he sent over several years ago, which was on the order of $200 million. So this is a very modest budget amendment, and with the greatest respect to the county executive, it certainly isn't justification for an ambulance fee, for example. So the county executive and myself and other members of the council have a difference of view with respect to whether or not circumstances have changed so dramatically as to justify coming back with the ambulance fee. I understand he was on radio on Friday that basically said I didn't have my facts right with respect to this issue, and again, with the greatest respect, we have a different point of view, and I believe the facts actually are on the side of myself and my colleagues, because the number with respect to the state budget, even assuming that we do have a pension cost shift, is estimated to be a net plus for the county in FY13 of approximately $4.5 million. And in FY16, I apologize, ladies and gentlemen, I apologize to you too. So that with respect to the question of whether or not we need an ambulance fee in order to address the budget that the legislature may adopt, we don't know if it will, and I'll speak to that momentarily, but assuming that they were to adopt what had been on the table and shift to the county responsibility with respect to pensions, that number is, we get a net $4.5 million in FY13, and it is true that by FY16 it's a negative $9 million. But those are numbers that are something that our county certainly can adjust to without an ambulance fee, and that FY16 is a long way away, and hopefully the economy is going to look a little different in FY16. So we just have no sense as to what is going to be necessary at that point in time. So we just have a fundamental disagreement. But as to whether or not circumstances have changed so dramatically as to justify an ambulance fee, we just have a very different point of view. We understand that the state legislature will be reconvened, and I think it's May 15th is the date. Is that correct? May 15th, I believe, is the day that is being discussed. I have had conversations with the governor's office with respect to the special session, and understand from the governor's people and from our own delegation that the governor is continuing to discuss the possibility of transportation funding in the special session. And I certainly am among those that believe very strongly that we need a source of revenue for transportation funding. There's been some conversation with respect to alternatives to income taxes, of a sales tax, as in lieu of an increase in income tax. A 1 cent increase in the sales tax would generate something on the order of $600 million, which would mean that you would not need to increase income taxes, which of course for Montgomery County is a major issue because we don't want anything to harm our competitiveness. It would provide approximately $300 million for transportation funding and could result in a less costly pension shift. So if you balance the need for transportation funding into the equation, it's certainly an important discussion, and one that we hope that the legislature will at least engage with the governor on, and we very much would like the governor to be strong in that regard. Finally, let's see, tomorrow we'll be taking up the county disposition legislation that has been under discussion for some period of time. and I have a packet of amendments to that legislation that I'll be offering that is responsive to the concerns of the business community in particular that had been concerned that this legislation would get in the way of deals that need to happen. And the packet of amendments that I am offering is designed to ensure that, no, we're not going to get in the way. We're going to keep this a tight process. We're not going to get down into small little sets of issues. We're going to keep our focus on the big matters that our council believes it ought to have a role in and not get in the way whatsoever on the other deals. So those were the three items that were on my mind this morning, and open to your thoughts and questions.
Circling back to the ambulance fee, you were talking a little bit how, in your view, the numbers don't seem to justify going back to that. On kind of a more philosophical level, did you have any problem in that, in pursuing that, you would be going against what voters just said, in 2010? Is that part of the equation?
It's certainly part of the equation for me. I have concluded that you really don't get to the merits, which I believe the merits on the ambulance fee can be debated. But when the voters have spoken on precisely the same legislation only 17 months earlier, I don't believe that we ought to ignore the will of the people. Now, people argue that the voters didn't really understand it.
Yeah.
Well, my goodness, that argument could be used on so many different occasions. So I don't know if I find that to be a compelling justification either.
There was something I think that was brought up last week. I think it was on the topic of liquor control. I'm not sure. I was wondering if you could fill me in on that.
Was there something that was brought up last week on liquor control? I'm not familiar. I don't remember it, but my memory is not the
I
greatest.
wasn't sure if that was something we were going to talk about today.
No, we had a meeting with our Department of Liquor Control and before our committee the other day and went through their budget, and so you could be referring to that. And
Okay.
I don't think we had any problems with their budget. We have problems on certain aspects of their operation, but no.
And what would that be?
Well, mostly, historically, our county, because we have such control over liquor, restaurants have sometimes struggled with special orders on wine. And so the conversation with our Department of Liquor Control is how responsive are they being to restaurant owners to make sure that restaurants feel like they can serve what they want to serve and that the public will be well served by it. So we've gotten better, I understand. I had hosted a meeting of restaurants with our Department of Liquor Control about a year ago, and we agreed to reconvene that group and get a sounding from the restaurants as to whether or not they too were comfortable that it's gotten better. There was also discussion with respect to Sunday liquor sales, and that it appears to be a net $1 to $2 million benefit to the county. It doesn't appear to be taking sales away from the rest of the week, and so it seems as if it has been a positive contribution to our financial situation without a whole lot of downside.
Okay. With the ambulance fee, one of the biggest things that people have brought up was, and speaking with Councilmember Andrews, was that it was promised it wouldn't be brought up again. Is this in any way affected, or have you heard from any constituents in regards to something being promised and then going back on that? Is that weighing into maybe the decision a bit?
It's not weighing into mine. I basically think the voters have spoken. I do think the way in which the county executive has chosen to frame this debate is at odds with the legislation itself. The county executive has said that he needs these dollars because of what's happening in Annapolis. The legislation says that these dollars will be used to supplement, not supplant, the fire service. Yet there's no budget amendments that came over from the county executive to increase funding for the fire service. So it's clear that the intent actually is to use this to supplant dollars in contradiction to the express terms of the legislation. So a number of us are just having trouble putting all these pieces together into a coherent whole that we find defensible.
Do you think it's personal for him in that he pushed so hard for it, got a big defeat? What do you think is his motivation for doing it?
I guess the expression that comes to mind is that he has a bee in his bonnet. Okay? I think that's as best I can describe it for purposes of this conversation.
Have you told him that?
I haven't told him that. No, I
I
haven't
mean,
told him.
what's the extent of your conversations with him on this?
He's called me with respect to it, and he challenged my view that there haven't been changed circumstances, and we had a dialogue with respect to it, and I remain unconvinced of his point of view, but respectful. He clearly cares very deeply with respect to this. I do understand that this is something that he cares about.
With it being introduced to the council last week, I had spoken with each member individually, and it seems that that the council is once again pretty divided with respect to it. With it being as divided as it is, do you think that it might go to referendum again?
If it has a majority of my colleagues' support, I'm convinced it will go to referendum again.
And one of the questions that was brought up, Councilmember Irvin said that she would be in support of it if the funds were to go into the general fund and not to fire and rescue services. Has he mentioned where the money exactly will go to if it does pass?
Well, again, under the terms of the legislation itself, it is very explicit. It is to supplement, not supplant, fire and rescue funding. So it is very clear in the legislation. Now, my colleagues may seek to amend the legislation to allow it to be used for other purposes.
And is that something that has been discussed yet, of maybe keeping it, but, how the funds will be divided? Is that something that's been brought up at all?
Well, it hasn't been brought up with me because I think my colleagues appreciate my stance with respect to this matter, which was I opposed it when it was first proposed, and I oppose it now because the voters rejected it. So I will be a no vote with respect to this. So if there are a majority of my colleagues that feel otherwise and will amend the bill to make it more palatable to them, then that will be the will of the body.
Okay.
Is there any update on the Silver Spring Transit Center?
No, we are contemplating going into closed session tomorrow to hear from our Department of in closed session with respect to this matter, insofar as there is litigation that is certainly a possibility with respect to this. And so we will hear from them in a manner that allows us to speak more freely with respect to it.
The Department of General Services?
Yes.
What
And I don't know if WMATA will be there or not. I haven't been briefed as to, but they are a significant player with respect to this, so their views will be important.
Is that Folger Pratt coming or Patina?
They will not be in closed session, no.
And what questions are you trying to get answered in that session?
Well, as you may recall, Victor, when we got the report from Folger Pratt, it was heavily predicated on legal issues. Their report says that the building is just fine as an existing structure. One, they argue that since it is built, it is existing. Well, the standards for existing are different than the standards for new. So that's a legal issue. They have also raised the question as to whether or not, if it was determined that a lot of reconstruction was necessary in order to meet the standards, that would amount to, quote, economic waste. And then they cited a whole bunch of case law in support of that. So insofar as Folger Pratt has raised a number of legal issues, it is important to hear from our legal counsel with respect to these items.
This week, there's supposed to be a public hearing, I think, on fuel rates, is that right?
There is a public hearing on the energy surcharge, yes.
Can you tell me a little bit more about that?
Yes, 2 years ago, when the county executive concluded that we were in the hole by approximately $200 million, he brought over a increase in the energy taxes. And our council passed that, and we had agreed to have it sunset this year. So the county executive has proposed extending that tax in order to meet the budget, which is approximately $114 million. The business community has made it clear they're not real happy with that particular aspect of the budget. And so this is a public hearing on extending that
And what
piece.
is your position on it?
My position is I'm working with my colleagues as to how we can balance this budget. I do think it is problematic to think that in any 1 year you can absorb $114 million loss of revenue. And I think that's the difficulty we're in. One, we're still in the aftermath of a recession, and two, it's just too big a chunk of dollars to take on all at once. If there were ways in which we could reduce that tax by a modest amount and over time reduce it further, I think that would be a positive development for our community. And we'll see if the revenue is there to allow us to do that.
Going back to Silver Spring, what concerns do you have about the fact that since it's, I guess the building has taken now more than 3.5 years to be constructed, and the original estimates was that both Mark and the building will be done in 2 years, and now we're kind of in this weird sort of space. So, I mean, what do you think there's a disservice to the Silver Spring commuter, or what concerns do you have?
Well, I think the most fundamental concern is what is the structural integrity of this building? And we need expert counsel with respect to that. It's clear they did not meet the specifications. So then you have to make an assessment as to whether or not the specifications were the proper specifications, or were they over the top to begin with? Are they okay? What's the structural integrity of this building? So there is, your first instinct when you hear that they didn't meet the specs would be, oh my goodness, then the building isn't what it was supposed to be. Well, we don't really know that now. We don't know what the structural integrity of it is. So let's assume for purpose of this conversation that they didn't meet the specs, but the building itself is actually very sound. Well, okay, and then we have different decisions to make. So I think we need to be comfortable that the building is sound and will last a long time. If we're not comfortable with that, then we're in a different world.
I mean, well, my question is more geared to the sheer time that has passed. I mean, it's been going on since.
This is a major, major construction project. All right. Am I disappointed that it isn't up and running right now? Absolutely. I mean, do the people of Silver Spring, and do we want to be encouraging transit? And is this going to play a significant role in doing that? Absolutely. But we are where we are, and I think people have some understanding of the scope of this construction project. It's one of the largest construction projects going on in the state of Maryland. It's a huge deal. So we just need to make sure that we get it right and that we move forward as expeditiously as possible.
And are you at all concerned by the fact that, I guess, like, wants, has increased the cost of the center and also is asking for more, not that much more, but I mean, $80,000 of government debt in order to keep this going? I mean, it's sort of...
In the best of all worlds, would we need it? No, but again, I think that this is on the margin and is acceptable. What else, guys?
I had a question. On April 16th, you introduced this Chief Innovation Officer position. You wrote a letter to Ike.
I did.
What have you heard back? What happens now?
Actually, the county executive has discussed it with me, and he likes the idea. So now it is needed to talk with my colleagues and see whether or not we can find the budget space for it. I've just spoke with the chief administrative officer this morning and asked him for a budget number that he thinks is appropriate with respect to this, and then I have to work with my colleagues and see if they think that this is a worthy endeavor to take on this year. I do, because I believe that it's important for us to demonstrate to the public and to ourselves that we are going to be innovators. And I feel that our county has lost a bit of its edge in that regard, and that this position will assist us in harnessing the creative talents of our citizens. And recently there was a national article written about this position in very favorable terms. So I'm eager to move forward in this regard, and hopefully in the context of putting together this budget, we'll be able to do so, but there are no guarantees.
And the budget numbers is salary?
The budget numbers would be basically salary, yeah, and benefits.
Any timetable on when you expect to hear back?
Oh, I'm trying to get this done for this budget, so.
Feels like we're May 24th.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
I apologize if this is just because I haven't been covering it like these guys, obviously, but if this has been decided already. But with the energy tax and discussing whether to go back to it, has there been a determination in the council? Would there be another sunset on it, or would it be something that you guys would want to make permanent?
Well, again, I tried to speak to that. I think
you
the
talked about lowering the
I think the
rate, but-
difficulty with sunsetting is that I don't know in any one year where we're going to be in a position to absorb $114 million loss in revenue.
Mhm.
But could I imagine doing it in chunks of 20 million?
Yeah.
I could. So I know that some of my colleagues are eager to, quote, sunset it, and I just don't know how realistic it is. And the last thing I want to do is put ourselves in a position where we're breaking faith with our public. And there are people that believe we are doing so by not honoring the sunset this time. So I don't want to replicate that going forward. So my own personal view is that to the extent to which people feel that we need to make progress in reducing that tax burden, which certainly the business community, we've got hospitals that are paying, an additional $1 million in energy taxes, and they go, "Why, we can't do this."
Do you think it would be breaking the faith, as you just coined it?
Well, I think any time that you sunset something and then make a different determination, that there are people that will argue that. I think the assumption that the council had in mind at that time is that we would be well on the other side of the economic recession that we were plunged into, and that assumption turned out not to be true. We're beginning to work our way out of it. So our assumption with respect to sunsetting didn't pan out. So yes, we're not doing what we said we would do, and there are reasons why we're not doing it.
Do you think the public gets that? Do you think the public grasps that argument, or are you afraid that they're just going to say we were told one thing and it's
I
not
think
happening?
I think the public will not be particularly happy.
Gotcha.
There's a briefing on bus fires today, and what are you expecting to find out, and what questions do you have on that?
Well, the issue's been raised as to what the county's response has been on its buses to these fires, that other jurisdictions took the buses immediately out of service. I was approached by people that have said that our county has not taken them out of service, and that there's concerns by drivers, there's concerns by passengers that these buses may not be safe. And so we need to understand, how's our county responding? Apparently there's a federal investigation involved. So you have the combination of federal investigation, you have a combination of passengers being nervous, you have bus drivers being nervous, and I need to understand exactly what our county's posture is with respect to this.
What do you hope that posture would be?
My hope would be that our county is handling this matter in the most prudent way possible. I want to understand why we are keeping these buses in, and understand what the assessment is with respect to the safety with respect to it.
Have you received any data? Has the bus fires had an effect on ridership?
I have not seen that data, so it's one of the questions that we'll be posing as well.
And just one final thing, going back, just broken record, going back to Silver Spring, who requested the closed session?
I did.
Okay, you did.
Actually, but David Dice, who's the head of the Department of General Services, suggested that if we wanted to explore these matters further, that he thought it best to do it in closed session.
What's the reasoning for it?
Again, the reasoning for it is that the issues are closely linked to potential litigation, that it's impossible to separate the wheat from the chaff.
Man, you're just full of these.
I got him going today.
You got
The
a
bee
new
in the
one?
bonnet and the wheat. This is a nature day, guys. I'm a Midwestern guy at heart. What can I say? Does that do it?
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.